There's plenty of new exciting features in Tailwind CSS version 3, so let's dive right into it. The new just-in-time engine has now replaced the classic engine, which means that Tailwind 3 gets a huge performance boost and new features like stackable variants, arbitrary values, and more. So here's a brand new Tailwind project. I have the default CSS input file and the default config file, and all I need to get started is to define our content array here. We need to tell the just-in-time engine which template files to look for. In my project, I have an src folder with 2 HTML files. So here I'll set ./src/ and catch all the HTML files within that directory, like so. So let's jump in our index.html file, and here on the right panel, I have the output CSS file, which is where Tailwind generates our CSS. I've disabled preflight here just so we can better see the on-demand class generation from our templates. And we're going to add a class attribute to our h1 tag. So I'll give it a class of text 4xl and text blue 500. And you can see Tailwind generates our CSS on demand, and it does so really, really fast. And so like I mentioned, you can also use arbitrary values. So let's set a width with a magic number of 478 pixels. And since only the classes you use are actually generated, we don't have to worry about file size at all anymore. We don't have to worry about purging at the end of the process. And it opens doors for a lot of new features without having to worry about the file size ballooning. For example, stackable variants. So here, let's target the large breakpoint, and let's use motion safe, and then focus, hover, and only under those compound conditions we'll go -translate y4. And Tailwind will generate the CSS that is necessary to support this exact specific scenario. Not only are all variants enabled by default in Tailwind 3, but the just-in-time engine allowed us to add a ton of new variants as well. Many of those were actually introduced in Tailwind CSS version 2.1 or 2.2 under the just-in-time preview. If you didn't opt in that preview, chances are you haven't seen them yet. Things like first letter, selection, before, after, peer selector, and many more. We've covered a lot of these in the Tailwind CSS 2.2 release video, so you can check that out, but I'll quickly show you a couple of them now. For example, here's how the selection variant works. So here, if I select the text, you can see we have this default blue, and I'll change this color with selection BG Sky 500 for the background and selection text white. And that gives us pretty nice selection styles. Let me show you another one. First letter. And here we'll go with text 7XL, first letter font black. And to make it on brand, first letter text Sky 500. We're really excited about just-in-time being the default and only mode now because it brings incredible performance and gives us permission to add new features in a way that was not possible before. Tailwind CSS version 3 brings an extended color palette enabled by default. That's a total of 22 colors, including 5 grays, which have been renamed to better coexist. Colors were one of the main contributors to file size ballooning in Tailwind 2, which is why we had to ship a more limited set of colors. However, now in Tailwind 3, thanks to the new just-in-time engine, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And here's what it looks like in Tailwind 3. Colors for days. Let's try out the new colored box shadow utilities, and so we're going to give these buttons a little bit of a glow. So for each of the 4 buttons, I'll add a shadow XL utility and then make that shadow colored with shadow dash. And here you see that we now have all Tailwind's colors available as box shadow colors. So here I'm going to mirror the background color of each button, like so. Alright, so this is definitely glowing. You can probably tell that this shadow is a little bit too intense, and the reason is the color opacity is always 100% when you add a colored shadow. So what we want to do is tame down the color opacity by adding a opacity modifier. So here I think we will go with 30%. And yeah, I think that works really well, and we now have a nice glowing effect under our buttons. Creating a glow effect like this is not the only way that colored box shadow utilities are useful. Sometimes you may have an element on a light background color, and in this case, it makes sense to use a colored shadow instead of a neutral shadow for better, more natural results. As an example, let's take a look at this white button sitting on a light pink background, and currently it has a box shadow which is using a gray color. It does look pretty nice, but let's see how it stands compared to a button with a colored box shadow. So let's grab this button and duplicate it. And on this new button, let's set a colored shadow with shadow pink 600. And we'll set the opacity here to 20%. Alright, so it's pretty subtle and probably even more subtle on video, but this button with the colored shadow feels a little bit more natural. It feels like the shadow is picking up a bit of the background and looks just a little bit more realistic. And so that's a good use case for a colored shadow and a pretty good design tip for you. The new print variant lets you bring modifications to your designs and get them ready for printing. Here's a recipe website example, and to help us avoid pouring flour all over our computer, there is the print functionality here with this button. Well, there's a couple of things that bother me with this printed recipe here. First of all, it's on 2 pages. And the second page here is literally just the footer of the website, which I'm pretty sure is not going to help me bake these cookies. Same deal with the navigation up here on the first page. I don't really need this. And there's one more thing that bothers me is the contrast on the text, which is using a light gray color, and I want to change this to black. So let's see how we can improve the print experience with this design using the print variant. We'll start by removing this header entirely and also removing the footer. This header tag is what we want to hide, so I'll use the print variant and simply set it to display none with hidden. And this print variant will wrap our display none inside a print media query. We'll do the exact same with our footer, print hidden. And now if we try to print the site again, the header and footer are gone. This is already a great improvement since the print fits in one page now. I think we can also remove these action buttons here since it doesn't make sense to have them on a printed page. And here's the div that wraps these 2 buttons, so one more time, print hidden. Okay, very nice. And the last thing I want to change is, like I mentioned before, the contrast. So I want to make the body copy pure black instead of this lightish gray. And also, if you compare with the footer, this background has a light warm gray tint, and I want it completely white. Right at the top is where we set the background and text color. And so here I'll go print BG white and print text black. Our website still looks exactly the same when viewed in the browser, but the printing experience should be much better. Alright, this is looking nice and clean, and I think it's time to put Tailwind ink to work one more time. Oh yeah, that's looking much better this time. Alright, I'll be right back. I got some baking and shopping to do.
2 hours later.
Here's a video embed from YouTube, and you will see that the aspect ratio is preserved no matter what the width of the viewport is. This is currently implemented using the first-party aspect ratio plugin. We're setting a width of 100% on the iframe itself, and then on the parent element you can see these 2 aspect ratio classes. The way this works, if I hover over this class, is using a technique known as the padding hack. The aspect ratio is obtained by applying a padding bottom of a value which is the calculation between the height and width ratio we want to achieve. That's applied to a parent element with a position of relative, and then the child element will have a position of absolute, and this is the element that we want to apply the aspect ratio to. So that works, but it's a little complicated. You need to apply the utilities to the parent element, and then you can only have one direct single child element for it to work properly. Tailwind 3 ships with new aspect ratio utilities, which makes this process much simpler. Let's get rid of our aspect ratio plugin. I'll also remove the wrapping div here, which had the utility classes generated by the plugin. The video embed looks kind of wonky now. It has a width of 100% and a height of the default height of an iframe, which is 150 pixels. This time, directly on the iframe element, I will add aspect, and you can see that by default, Tailwind ships with 2 aspect ratio presets, aspect square 1:1 and aspect video 16:9, which is exactly what we want to use here. This time, instead of the complicated padding bottom technique, we are simply applying aspect ratio 16:9 directly on the element. And just like that, our aspect ratio is back to what we want, and it's preserved no matter what width of viewport we're using. Hey, I know that guy. Here's another example. For this one, I'll have to zoom in a little bit so we can see what happens when we resize the browser window. So let's narrow it down. And you can see that the image height remains the same, and then the image gets cropped based on the width so that it fills the entire space. On our image element, you can see that we have a set height of 48, and then we use object cover to make sure that the image uses the whole space available. Let's say that instead of that behavior, we wanted to apply a constant aspect ratio here. To do that, we can remove the fixed height and use an aspect ratio utility instead. So we've tried video before, so let's try square 1:1. And so now our cover image maintains a perfectly square aspect ratio. We only ship with 2 presets by default, video and square, but check this out. The arbitrary value syntax here is actually pretty sweet. Instead of aspect square, I'll open brackets here, and inside I can create any aspect ratio that I need. For example, 3:1. And if you really wanted, you could even use decimals here. And when the page reloaded, we saw the image jump and get just a little bit higher to respect this new custom aspect ratio. Alright, for this demo, I'm going to use an iPad since it's going to make it a little bit easier to understand what's happening. So here's a travel website example, and it has a list of winter destinations, and as you can see, they can scroll horizontally. So currently, wherever I stop the scroll position, this is where the cards stay exactly, and this is the default behavior. We're going to use the new Scroll Snap Tailwind utilities to take control over where these cards stop or snap when the user stops scrolling. Since each of our destination cards uses the same HTML block, I've created a simple loop here, and we're outputting this block of HTML for each destination in our winter destinations. Those destinations come from a JSON array here. Okay, we need to define our scroll snap utility on the scroll container element, and in our case, this is this UL element here that contains all the destination cards. Since we're scrolling horizontally here, I'll use the class snapX. This class by itself isn't going to work just yet. As you can see, wherever I stop scrolling is where the cards stay. So what we need to do is define where we want the cards to snap. Do we want them to snap in the middle of the viewport like this? Do we want them to snap at the start, on the edge here, or at the end? And this is something we have to define on each child element within the scroll container. So let's add a class to the li element. And in this case, we want the cards to align to the center of the container when we stop scrolling. So I'll use snap center here. So now let's see what happens when we scroll. Nice. You can see that every time I scroll, the card snaps perfectly in the center of the viewport. If I don't scroll far enough, it'll just come back. And if I go past a certain point, it'll flick to the next one. Beautiful. Here's a one-page photography website example, and as I scroll down, you'll see that the navigation becomes sticky, and there is 4 sections in this website which are linked to from the navigation. And as you can expect, clicking on a specific section link jumps to that section in the page. So currently it's a little bit abrupt, it jumps right to the section, and also you might notice that the heading of the section is hidden behind the navigation here. Tailwind 3 brings some pretty cool new scroll utilities that makes it really easy to make this UI a little bit more polished. Let's start by making this navigation a little bit less abrupt by using the Scroll Smooth utility. Alright, so we need to set the scroll behavior on the scrolling container that we want to smoothly animate. And in our case, this is the entire website, so I will put a class on the HTML tag directly. Tailwind gives us a new Scroll Smooth utility class that will set the scroll behavior to smooth. And so now the HTML tag is set to scroll smoothly. So if I click on nature, you can see that it'll scroll down to that section nice and smooth. So that was pretty easy to implement. We still have this issue where if I click on nature, you can see the heading is hidden behind the navigation. And so what we want to do is affect the scroll position. We don't want to add margin on top, but we want to add a scroll margin utility. So I've got my 4 sections here that I have collapsed, and I'm going to add a class of scroll empty for margin top. And I can choose from the spacing scale, and I think here I will go with scroll margin top 24. So once again, scroll margin top does not affect the margin on top of the elements. It's really only affecting the scroll position. And so that means that now if I click on one of these navigation links, we should have a little bit of spacing under the navbar and see the heading properly, since we've added that scroll margin top of level 24. Let's take this article example and say we want to split the content here in multiple columns. Here's the elements that wraps our paragraph. And so here, one way to do this would be to use grid. And let's go with grid calls 2 for 2 columns and gap of 8. But for this to work, we need to separate our columns in container elements. So we'll have a div around the first 2 paragraphs and another div around the last 2. While we have split the text in 2 columns, there's a few problems here. Because we've added extra wrappers, we have lost the spacing set between the paragraphs. And if I wanted to change the columns to 3 columns, we would need to change the markup and rearrange the wrapping divs so that our content spreads across 3 columns. It's not really that practical, as you need to know how much content you've got. That won't work in situations where your content is coming from, say, a CMS. Another issue is we can't have the column split mid-paragraph, which could help with having columns of equal size. CSS actually has a really nice solution to this problem. It's called multi-column layout, and it's now officially supported in Tailwind CSS. Alright, so we're gonna undo all of this and get back to our starting point. And let's type columns dash, and you can see we can define a range of columns. Let's go with 2 here. So now we've got 2 columns, and let's quickly try 3 columns as well. And there you go. And you can see that the text has been split automatically in a way that makes the columns as equal in length as possible. We didn't have to mess around with any wrapping divs. The content split has happened automatically. If you want to control the gutter spacing between the columns, you can use the existing gap utilities. So here for our horizontal gap between the columns, we'll use gap X, and I will go with 12 here. Alright, so our gap is increased. Now, I don't think that 3 columns works that well with that gap, so let's go back to 2 columns. And yeah, that looks really nice. Another really cool thing that you can do is, instead of manually defining the number of columns, like we do here, is to use responsive columns utilities. So if I go down after the 1 to 12 columns, we also have columns utilities like 3XS, 2XS, which instead of setting a number of columns, will set a column width and then let the browser decide how many columns it can fit within the layout. So let's say we like the column width of 320 pixels. We'll go with columns XS. We still have 2 columns here because this is the amount of 320 pixel wide columns that can fit within this container. But if in the article wrapper here, I change the max width container from 3XL to 6XL, now there's enough space to have 3 columns within the container, so the text is going to automatically split in 3 columns. And so responsive column utilities are super useful when you want to let the browser decide how many columns to use based on the space available. Here's a settings form example, and as I go through the fields, you'll see that we have this brand color going. However, the file upload button has the default browser styles, and if I click on the radio buttons or the checkbox, you can see they use the default system blue. Let's make this form more on brand with 2 simple changes. I'll start by changing the accent color for the radio buttons and checkbox. Since I want all the inputs in this form to take our brand accent color, I'll go in the form element and here add an accent color utility and use our brand color of violet 500. And just like that, our radio buttons and checkbox match the brand a little bit closer. The next obvious thing we want to change is this file upload button, and here's the input element. So maybe let's start by adding a background color with BG, and we'll use our violet brand color, and here I'll go with 200. And that's not what we were hoping for. The whole input has a violet 200 background and our button is still gray. And this is where the new file modifier comes handy. Let's try it out. I'll keep this violet 200 background class, but I'll prefix it with file column. Doing so will scope this class to the file selector button pseudo class, which happens to be the selector for this button. So you can see that now the button has a background of violet 200 and not the whole input. Let's continue styling that button. So we have a background color, and for the text color, I'll go file text violet 700, and I'll also change the font weight with file font semi-bold. Nice, and let's also remove this default border with file border none. Next, let's add some internal padding and rounded corners. File px4 and file py2 for the padding, and file rounded full for the rounded corners. Starting to look pretty good. Let's add a bit of spacing between the button and the text here with file margin right 6. And for the last touches, I'll add a simple hover state. And here we'll stack 2 variants together, hover, file, and we'll change the background color with BG, and we'll use violet 100. And with these simple changes that didn't require much effort, our form is looking much more on brand. Okay, so here we have a list of frequently asked questions, and as you can see, each question can be toggled, opened, or closed. These FAQs are implemented with the details tag, meaning that it will only show the summary when it's closed, and when it's open, it will show the rest. Let's say that we wanted to apply different styles to a question when it's open to attract more attention to it. So let me show you something. I'll apply a background of white as well as a shadow XL on the first details element. And so now it clearly stands out, but we want these styles to be applied only when the question is open and not when it's closed like this. And turns out the details element has an open attribute to it when it's open. To demonstrate that, I'll go in the second details and add open. And you can see now the second question is displayed as open. And we can target this open attribute with the new open variant and do the same for the shadow, open column. And just like that, these utilities will only be applied when the details element is open. So here's the bio section of a designer's personal website, and you can see it includes a few links in it. Let's bring a little bit of variation and color to them using the new text decoration utilities. Here's our 3 links with the class of underline, and here we're going to add the decoration dash class, and you can see we have access to all of Tailwind's colors here. And so the first link will be Ember 500, and we'll make the second Sky 500, and the last one Pink 500. And just like that, we've got colorful links now. And you can see that the underline is skipping the descenders in the words, which is pretty nice and something that you cannot do with borders. The new arbitrary properties allow you to use absolutely any CSS property you can think of, even if it hasn't been added to Tailwind CSS yet. Let's take a look. All right, so we're going to take this little article as an example. And so we've got a bit of text and then a floated image. We're going to use a couple of CSS properties that are not part of Tailwind CSS to play around with the image and how the text wraps around it. So here's our image tag, and here I'll open square brackets for the new arbitrary properties syntax. And inside of that, you can use absolutely any CSS key value pair. So on our image, let's use the clip path property, and we'll set the value to the circle shape. Okay, nice, but let's have a little bit more fun with it. So I want a circle which has a radius of 70% and has its center at 20% from the left and 30% from the top. Now watch out, arbitrary values cannot contain spaces, so here we're going to replace each of the space with an underscore, which will resolve to the correct syntax. Alright, that's kind of interesting now, but it would be much nicer if the text was wrapping around the image following the curve here. And for that, we can use another CSS property called shape outside. And here I'll use the exact same circle than in our clip path. And just like that, we've created a clipping mask for our image, and we have the text wrapping around nicely around the curve. And so here's the CSS we've generated on the fly. And that's pretty cool, but you may ask more than ever, why not just use inline styles? The real power of these arbitrary properties is they can do things that are absolutely impossible with inline styles. Arbitrary properties can be paired with any of Tailwind's modifier, whether it be hover or focus state, or maybe a responsive breakpoint, something you cannot do with inline styles. Back in our example, we have a different aspect ratio applied to the image at a larger breakpoint, and with that aspect ratio, our circle clip path kind of falls apart. So we got a clip path definition here, and we'll redefine this at the large breakpoint. So LG, and once again, clip path. And here, instead of a circle, we're going to have a polygon. And here, I'll just paste some coordinates for our polygon points. Notice once again that the spaces are replaced with underscores. So let's take a look. And yeah, nice. Our new clip path looks pretty good. You can see that the text is still following the curve from the circle that we had defined. So once again, let's copy that polygon. And for the large breakpoint, the shape outside property will follow this exact same polygon. And boom, that's looking pretty cool. All right, we've just done something that inline styles cannot do, define 2 properties, and then redefine these 2 properties in a media query for the large breakpoint. So let's take a look at the result. We have the circle crop until we hit the large breakpoint, and then we have a custom shape polygon. By the way, arbitrary properties also work with CSS custom properties or CSS variables. Let's take a quick look. So let's say in our CSS input file, we define the variable at the root scope, my shape. And so here it would be a circle. You could totally replace the 2 instances where we use that shape with var -- my shape. So now the real cool thing here, instead of redefining these 2 properties, I can get rid of one of them and simply redefine the my shape variable to be a polygon. And these are using the root scope my shape value, which is our circle. And then at the large breakpoint, we redefine the value of my shape, which will update the clip path and shape outside properties. And let's verify that. Circle and polygon. That's pretty cool. The new Play CDN gives you all the power of Tailwind CSS via a simple script tag in your document head. So here's a bare bones HTML page, and I'm going to add a script tag that points to cdn.tailwindcss.com. And just like that, I have access to the full power of Tailwind CSS. Let's try it out. Text for XL, text center, Arbitrary values also work, so text dash, and let's use a hex color of 1E90FF. You can customize your config file in another script tag, and here I'll override the default tailwind.config. So here I can access the theme. We're going to extend our colors object with a new fancy blue color, and this hex value is the same that I've used down here, so I can now replace this with text fancy blue, and it still works. Let's write some custom CSS in a style tag, and by giving it a custom type attribute of text/tailwind CSS, I can now inside here use Tailwind's custom functions and directives. So let's create a class called myClass, and here I'll use @apply, and we'll consolidate the utilities that we had used on the h1 below. Okay, now let's go in the h1 tag and delete these classes. So you can see in the preview that the styles are gone, and we're going to replace that with myClass. And yep, that just works. Please note that the play CDN, as its name suggests, is meant to play or prototype with Tailwind. We do not recommend using this in production, as you won't obtain the best performance results. Woo! We've covered a lot, and we've definitely not covered everything. There's plenty more, like support for text indent, wheel change, touch actions, flex bases, and much more. Be sure to check out the release notes for a full list of things we've added to Tailwind CSS 3.0. We really hope you enjoyed this release. I'm gonna sign off for now. You're an absolute legend for watching this video all the way through. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Have fun!